The grand hall of the Celeste Grand Hotel shimmered with golden hues as chandeliers cast their soft glow over a sea of well-dressed industry elites. The evening was an extravagant affair, a Hollywood gala meant to celebrate progress and innovation in the film world. However, beneath the surface of polite laughter and well-rehearsed conversations, the event was little more than a power play, where alliances were formed, reputations were carefully managed, and careers were either boosted or quietly dismantled. Keanu Reeves entered the venue with the same understated presence that had always defined him. He didn't arrive with an entourage or make an exaggerated entrance. Instead, he moved with quiet confidence, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit. The silver crucifix resting against his chest swayed slightly as he walked, an almost imperceptible detail, yet, to some, it was a message. Across the room, Dylan Carter observed him like a hunter tracking prey. A rising journalist with a reputation for taking down public figures, Dylan had a knack for exposing contradictions and forcing celebrities into uncomfortable corners. His articles, laced with biting critiques and sharp wit, had made waves in progressive media circles. Tonight, he had his sights set on Keanu. Most. Keanu was an enigma, respected yet unpredictable, deeply private yet effortlessly charismatic. He didn't chase the spotlight, and he had turned down blockbuster roles that didn't align with his principles. Most curiously, he held on to something Hollywood often dismissed: personal conviction, and Dylan saw an opportunity in that. Sipping his whiskey, he watched the actor exchange a few words with a director before stepping momentarily away from the main crowd. It was the perfect moment. Setting down his glass, Dylan adjusted his blazer, straightened his tie, and approached Keanu with the calculated ease of a man who had rehearsed his lines in advance. "Keanu, mind if I ask you a quick question?" he began, flashing a practiced, friendly smile. Keanu turned to him, his expression neutral yet polite. "Sure." Dylan activated the recording function on his phone, ensuring that every word would be captured. He took a moment, carefully choosing the right tone, one that seemed casual but carried the weight of unspoken expectations. "You've always positioned yourself as someone forward-thinking," Dylan said, "but don't you think wearing a crucifix at an event like this feels outdated?" The words were deliberately measured, loud enough for nearby guests to take notice. A few people turned their heads, sensing a conversation worth eavesdropping on. Keanu didn't flinch. He simply studied Dylan, his dark eyes calm, unreadable. Dylan continued, pressing forward. "Hollywood is changing. We're moving past traditions that have, let's be honest, been used to justify exclusion. Don't you think that, in an industry pushing for progress, religious symbols should be left in the past?" The silence that followed was deliberate, stretching just long enough to create tension. Eyes darted between the two men. A young actress near the bar smirked, clearly enjoying the brewing confrontation. A seasoned producer exchanged glances with his colleague, both intrigued. Keanu took a slow breath, as if considering whether the question was even worth addressing. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, controlled. "Since when did believing in something become a problem?" The counter was simple, yet it landed with weight. Dylan blinked. He had expected either a dismissive chuckle or a defensive answer, perhaps a generic nod toward freedom of belief. Instead, Keanu had turned the question back on him. Dylan hesitated only for a second before regaining his composure. "I'm not saying belief is a problem," he countered smoothly, "but the cross, throughout history, it's been tied to oppression. Do you really think that's the message you want to send?" He had chosen his words carefully. The term oppression was designed to trigger a reaction, to frame Keanu into either defending or distancing himself from his own beliefs. But Keanu's face remained unreadable. When he responded, his tone was unshaken. "Faith doesn't oppress, Dylan. People do." A murmur rippled through the nearby crowd. A few discreet nods. A subtle shift in energy. Dylan felt it, the conversation slipping from his control. He had expected an easy victory, a viral moment of Keanu struggling to justify himself. Instead, he was the one who now felt cornered, and he wasn't ready to back down. Dylan's fingers tightened around his phone as he quickly recalibrated. He had spent years perfecting his ability to manipulate narratives, to turn interviews into exposés. This was supposed to be another one of those moments, an opportunity to force a celebrity into either fumbling over his words or making an unintentional misstep, but Keanu wasn't giving him what he wanted. Dylan leaned in slightly, his tone shifting from feigned curiosity to something sharper, more direct. "With all due respect, Keanu," he said, though the words carried no real respect at all, "wearing that crucifix at an event like this sends a message, whether you mean it to or not. Hollywood is moving forward. Symbols like that, they belong to the past." This time, there was no murmur of agreement from the crowd. In fact, something about the way Dylan phrased it seemed to put people on edge. Some exchanged wary glances, sensing the hostility beneath his words. A few others, who had been watching in amusement, now looked uncomfortable, realizing this wasn't just a casual question, it was an attack. Keanu, however, remained unfazed. If he was bothered by Dylan's increasingly aggressive stance, he didn't show it. Instead, he took a slow sip of his wine, then lowered the glass with the kind of ease that made it clear he was in no rush to react. Finally, he spoke, "Do you think kindness, hope, and love have become obsolete?" Dylan blinked. He hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. The question hung in the air, deceptively simple yet carrying an undeniable weight. It wasn't just a response, it was a challenge. Dylan opened his mouth, then hesitated. He had been prepared for an argument about religion, about outdated traditions, about whether or not Hollywood should embrace or reject symbols of faith. But Keanu had reframed the conversation entirely, and the crowd knew it. A few people nodded slightly, murmuring amongst themselves. A veteran director, who had been sipping his champagne near the bar, smirked knowingly, as if he had seen this kind of takedown before. A young producer, barely in his 30s, whispered to his colleague, "That was brilliant." Dylan felt the shift. He was losing his audience, and worse, he was losing control of the conversation. Frustration flickered across his face, but he refused to back down. Instead, he tried one last move, one designed to hit Keanu on a personal level. "With all due respect," Dylan said again, though now the words carried a hint of mockery, "people from your generation had it easy. It's easy to talk about faith when you've never had to fight for anything." A stunned silence fell over the room. Even those who had initially been indifferent to the exchange now tensed. Everyone knew about Keanu's past, or at least, they should have. The actor's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. For a moment, the only sound was the distant clinking of glasses, a quiet backdrop to the weight of Dylan's words. And then, Keanu spoke. "Easy," he repeated, the word almost a whisper. He tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely trying to understand how Dylan could have come to such a conclusion. Dylan swallowed hard. Keanu continued, his voice measured but firm. "I've been rejected from more auditions than you can count. I've slept on borrowed couches because I couldn't afford rent. I've lost people I loved. The air in the room grew heavy. My best friend died of an overdose. The woman I loved was killed in a car accident. My daughter died before she was even born." A quiet gasp rippled through the crowd. Dylan turned pale. That he had walked into this thinking he could expose Keanu Reeves, thinking he could paint him as out of touch. But he had done no research. He had no idea of the pain, the loss, the weight Keanu carried with him every day. Keanu's voice remained steady, but there was something undeniable in his words, a depth of experience that no amount of rhetoric could argue against. "Do you think faith kept me standing because my life was easy?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "No, Dylan. Faith kept me standing because my life was hard." The room was completely silent now. Dylan tried to find something, anything, to say. But there was nothing, because he had lost, and worst of all, Keanu had never even needed to raise his voice to defeat him. Dylan felt a tightness in his throat as the weight of Keanu's words settled over him. The room, once filled with idle chatter and the clinking of champagne glasses, was now eerily silent. The people who had been watching out of curiosity were no longer just spectators, they were witnesses to something far greater than the journalist had intended. He had come here to corner Keanu Reeves. Instead, he had exposed himself, desperate to regain control. Dylan forced out a thin, almost nervous chuckle. "Look, Keanu," he started, trying to inject some casual charm into his tone. "I didn't mean to." But Keanu wasn't done. His voice remained calm, almost gentle, yet there was an unshakable firmness beneath it. "Dylan, I get it," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You wanted to make a point. You wanted to push me into a corner and see how I'd react. But let me ask you something." Keanu took a step forward, closing the distance between them ever so slightly. He wasn't threatening. He didn't need to be. The power in his presence came from something far deeper. "What do you believe in?" Dylan blinked. He wasn't sure he had heard the question correctly. Keanu held his gaze, unwavering. "You're quick to challenge what I believe, but I haven't heard you say what you stand for. So tell me, Dylan, what do you believe in?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it struck like a blade. Dylan's lips parted, but no words came out, because the truth was, he didn't know that he had spent years tearing people down, exposing flaws, crafting headlines that would go viral, but he had never once stopped to ask himself what he actually stood for. A murmur spread through the crowd. People exchanged glances, some whispering to each other. A few of them, directors, actors, producers, had once been on Dylan's side, admiring his ruthless approach to journalism. Now, they saw something different. They saw a man who had built his career on scrutiny but had never dared to turn that scrutiny on himself. Keanu didn't press him for an answer. He simply let the silence speak for itself, and it did, louder than any headline, louder than any viral clip, louder than any carefully crafted argument Dylan could have prepared. For the first time in his career, Dylan Carter had no words. He swallowed hard, gripping his whiskey glass so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced for a way out, a clever retort, a way to twist this moment back in his favor. But nothing came, because Keanu wasn't playing the game, and that was what made this so devastating. Dylan looked around, searching for an ally in the room. Someone who would jump in, change the subject, rescue him from the unbearable weight of the moment, but there was no one. Keanu, on the other hand, simply gave a small nod, as if to say, "That's all I needed to know." Then, with the same quiet ease he had carried all night, he turned and walked away. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk, because he hadn't needed to win. He had only needed to be himself, and that, more than anything, was what left Dylan Carter standing alone, exposed, and utterly humiliated. Dylan stood frozen in place, his grip on the whiskey glass unsteady. His throat was dry, his mind blank. He had never felt this before, not in an interview, not in a debate, not even in the most brutal online backlash. This wasn't just embarrassment. It was exposure. The whispers in the room had grown into low murmurs, like distant waves crashing against a rocky shore. No one was outright laughing at him, but the pity in their eyes was worse than mockery. He was no longer the sharp, untouchable journalist who could twist any narrative in his favor. He was just a man who had been completely, undeniably outmatched. Dylan forced himself to move, stepping away from the spot where Keanu had left him standing. He needed an escape, a conversation to slip into, someone to nod at, anything to make it seem like this moment hadn't unraveled him. But as he walked through the crowd, the reactions were all the same. A polite nod, but no engagement. A half smile, then a quick turn away. A whispered remark to a friend, just out of his earshot. Even the people who had once supported him, the same Hollywood insiders who had cheered on his articles exposing public figures, were suddenly keeping their distance. Dylan Carter had become radioactive. At the bar, he downed what was left of his whiskey, the burn doing little to dull the ache settling in his chest. He pulled out his phone, instinctively scrolling through social media. Maybe he could still salvage this, but the damage had already been done. Trending: Keanu shuts down arrogant journalist in the best way possible. Dylan's stomach dropped. He clicked on the hashtag. Clips of the exchange were everywhere, recorded from different angles, capturing Keanu's effortless composure and Dylan's slow, painful unraveling. Some of the top comments hit harder than any of Keanu's words. Dylan tried to trap Keanu, and Keanu didn't even need to fight back. He just was. This dude thought he could outwit Keanu Reeves. Bad life choice. Faith isn't meant to be displayed. It's meant to be lived. Damn. That one hit deep. Dylan clenched his jaw. He had been the one recording the conversation. His phone had been the first to capture the moment. And yet, he had completely lost control of the narrative. He scrolled further, his pulse quickening as he saw article headlines popping up. Keanu Reeves silences pushy reporter with a single question. Dylan Carter wanted to humiliate Keanu. Instead, he destroyed himself. The interview that ended a journalist's career? His fingers hovered over the screen. Could he still spin this? Could he find an angle that made him look like the one asking important questions instead of just another journalist trying to create controversy? But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no saving this, because this time, he wasn't the one telling the story had already told itself. Dylan's hands trembled slightly as he locked his phone screen, shoving it into his pocket as if that could somehow erase the damage already done. He could feel the weight of every glance in the room, the silent judgment, the realization that he had lost, completely, utterly lost. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. He needed to leave, but leaving now would be worse than staying. If he walked out, it would be an admission of defeat, a retreat, a white flag raised in surrender. No, he had to act like this was just another conversation, just another story, just another night. So he did what he had always done best. He faked it. He turned toward a nearby group of actors and producers, slipping into their conversation with a forced chuckle. "Well," he said, swirling the ice in his empty glass, "that didn't go quite how I planned." A few of them smiled politely. Others merely nodded, their eyes darting away as if they didn't want to be associated with him now. Dylan felt it again, that distance, that quiet but unmistakable rejection, and that was when he knew, this wasn't going to blow over. This wasn't just another bad interview that would be forgotten in a few days. This moment, this humiliation, was going to stick. Across the room, Keanu Reeves was already deep in conversation with a director, laughing softly at a joke. It was as if the encounter with Dylan had never even happened, as if it hadn't been worth remembering. That, more than anything, stung the most. Keanu didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to post about it. He didn't need to do anything, because Dylan had already destroyed himself. He turned back toward the bar, ordering another drink. The bartender barely looked at him as he poured. Dylan took a slow sip, trying to drown the sickening feeling growing in his stomach. This was it. This was the moment that would follow him for the rest of his career, and no amount of clever writing, no amount of damage control, no amount of spinning the story could change the simple, brutal truth. Keanu Reeves hadn't just won. He had never needed to fight in the first place. And Dylan Carter, he had made himself irrelevant. As the night carried on, as conversations resumed and laughter filled the air, Dylan felt himself fading into the background. No longer feared, no longer admired, no longer important. And for the first time in his life, he realized what true defeat really felt like. The party continued, Hollywood moved on. But Dylan Carter never would. Dylan sat at the bar, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his whiskey glass. The once vibrant hum of conversation around him had dulled into white noise, as if the entire room had moved on without him. And in a way, it had. He had built his career on control, on knowing how to guide an interview, how to steer a conversation, how to turn words into weapons. But tonight, Keanu Reeves had taken that power away from him without even trying, and now Dylan was stuck in a slow-motion downfall, watching his name become synonymous with failure in real time. He took another sip of whiskey, his mind racing through the possibilities. He could still fix this. He had to. Maybe he could write an op-ed, spin the conversation into something deeper, claim that he had intentionally provoked Keanu to start a broader discussion about faith in modern Hollywood. He could make himself the misunderstood journalist, the one who dared to ask the tough questions. Yes. That could work. Dylan pulled out his phone again, the dim glow of the screen illuminating the desperation in his eyes. He opened his notes app and started typing. In the heat of conversation, sometimes the most unexpected moments reveal the greatest truths. Tonight, in my exchange with Keanu Reeves, I sought to challenge perspectives on tradition and progress. What I found instead was a lesson, one I hope we can all learn from. He paused, staring at the words. It wasn't bad. It sounded thoughtful. Reflective. It gave him an out, a way to reframe the disaster into something meaningful, but then he imagined the comments, the tweets, the viral reactions that he could already see the responses flooding in. Oh, now he's trying to act like this was his idea? LOL. Dylan, buddy, just take the L. Dude, you got wrecked. Stop trying to spin it. His fingers tightened around the phone, his chest constricting with the crushing realization that there was no rewriting this story. No clever words could erase what had already happened. He exhaled sharply, deleting the note before stuffing his phone back into his pocket. Maybe it was time to leave. Dylan pushed himself up from the barstool, adjusting his blazer as he scanned the room one last time. The event was still in full swing, but it might as well have been happening on another planet. No one was waiting for him. No one was hoping for a follow-up to his failed ambush. Keanu, on the other hand, was still effortlessly at ease, speaking with a group of industry veterans. If he had even thought about Dylan in the past 10 minutes, it didn't show. That was what stung the most, not that he had lost, but that he hadn't even mattered. With one last gulp of whiskey, Dylan set the glass down and turned toward the exit. As he walked through the gilded halls of the Celeste Grand Hotel, past glittering chandeliers and carefully curated luxury, he realized something he had never allowed himself to consider before. For all the stories he had told, for all the reputations he had helped build and destroy, he had never once asked himself who he really was. And maybe that was why, when faced with a man who knew exactly who he was, he had crumbled so easily. The night air was cool against his face as he stepped outside. The city stretched before him, bright and indifferent. Dylan Carter had spent years controlling narratives, but tonight, for the first time, he wasn't the storyteller. He was just another forgotten headline, and this time, there would be no comeback.